Hi, my name is Shams Trajani. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to be the publisher also, since we've had so many people speculating and saying things about publishers, and people have had different opinions and thoughts and ideas, and it's just fun to be just hearing all these things and having my 15 moments to surprise you, hopefully. I've been asked to come here today to do one of the talks that I usually do. I've done it at different conferences for students around Sweden. Since there are not that many publishers in Sweden, in fact, there's only one, essentially, a Swedish publisher. EA operates out of Sweden, Stockholm, but they're not a Swedish publisher, per se. I'll tell you a bit about myself. I'll talk a bit about Paradox, and then I'll talk in general terms about how you can work with publishers and what kind of roles you guys will have and what you can expect. And this is supposed to be an hour. I can do this in 1 hour or 2 hours. It very much depends on you guys. So feel free to stop me at any time and raise your hand and just ask me a question. I'll try to help. So let's get the show on the road. So who am I? My name is Shams, as I said again. I'm a producer and a biz dev guy at Paradox, which essentially means that I sign the games. I decide which games we should work on in the future together with our CEO, and try to decide how we should proceed with our existing games. My background is that I studied at Stockholm University and I studied engineering at KTH. And then I kind of slipped into the gaming industry without actually intending to. I started off at Avalanche with a lot of people here. I started on a Monday, and on Friday I got fired, together with 75 people. And this is, I think, a fairly common story from the gaming industry. How many people have actually gotten fired from Avalanche here? Like, yeah, there's a fair bunch. So from there, I actually came back like a parasite. Like an abused wife, I came back to Avalanche. She loves me. So I came back, and then I quit because I wanted to work on the publishing side. And when the opportunity at Paradox presented itself, it was an easy jump. And at Paradox, I've done just about almost everything. Actually, Linda's done more things, but I've done a fair bit as well. Marketing, producing, and biz dev. So I'm going to talk about myths and fears that exist and a lot of misconceptions about publishing in general. And one huge disclaimer I have is that a lot of this is based out of my experiences working out of Paradox as a PC publisher, but also we work with other publishers. And I'm not saying that this is how it's for the entire industry, but I think I have a fair insight. So whenever I say I think consoles suck, that's because I actually think so, and it's based off a bunch of my experiences. So just briefly tell you what I worked on before. I worked with on Just Cause 2 with a couple of guys here. How many worked on Just Cause 2? Like everybody at Avalanche, of course. I also produced Magica, and I'm working on the Showdown Effect with Mats right now, and Arrowhead Game Studios. So what made me? Why am I here today? These are the things that shaped me. These are the kind of games I played, and I'm influenced by them still yet today. I'll just leave it there, and then you can laugh and point at me later. I'm a big, huge nerd, you could say. So, briefly, Paradox Interactive. Paradox started as a small company called Äventyrsspel. How many know of Äventyrsspel? How many have played Drakar och Demoner? Yeah, you're also geeks. So, Fredrik Malmberg started Äventyrsspel in the early 80s. He went over to the US and saw a game called Dungeons and Dragons, and he brought it back home and essentially made Drakar och Demoner, which is a pen and paper role-playing game. That company then grew and became Target Games, and they had a bunch of stores called Tradition. Who's shopped at Tradition? Yeah. Who misses Tradition? Yeah, right. So, and they had an interactive division, which was called Paradox Interactive, and that was essentially sold off, and that's what became Paradox eventually. Paradox started off as an independent developer. They made weird PC games, and from this was 1999, and they moved from a small indie developer into what we are today, which is we call ourselves an indie publisher. And we broached upon what independent is, and that could be an entire lecture, but we won't do that today. Essentially, Paradox started by we made small games, we gave them to a publisher, and they sold them. And we realized that, you know what, they don't get our games. We make they made really map porn kind of games, you could say, essentially. The average Paradox customer is 35, male, and lives at home with his mother. So, and the publisher didn't really get how to market and sell those kind of games. So we said, you know what, screw that, we're going to do it ourselves. So when they released Hearts of Iron 2 and finally had some money to hire a new person, all the programmers were screaming, let's hire another programmer. And they said that a good game sells itself. And our CEO, he said, screw that, and he hired a marketer. And from that point on, everything just shooted towards the stars. And we noticed that, hey, you know what? We're fairly good at marketing and selling these weird PC games that nobody understands. So how about we find other people's PC games and start selling those? And that's how the publishing branch of Paradox started. The development team was like, there were 4 people initially. There are 22 right now. They're huge, but the publishing branch has grown. And today we're primarily a publisher, but we have one of the best development studios, in-house development studios in the world, I'd say. And essentially, you don't grow into a publisher overnight by publishing like a Call of Duty title. You have to do a lot of titles. You have to do a lot of crap games. And that's essentially what we did. I mean, Paradox has not stood for and still does not stand for quality. What we stand for probably is PC weirdness, like the emo PC kid in the corner. And that's what we do. We focus on PC, digital strategy, the niche, and the hardcore. And it's a very sweet spot for us to be in. Today, we still make the niche PC games, but we've broadened out into other niches. So from left to right, we have the Showdown Effect, which is Arrowhead's next game. It's a kind of game that you find on consoles, but you don't find it on PC anymore. There used to be a game called Liero in the 90s on PC, and that's kind of the game we're trying to recreate. And Smash Bros. Doesn't exist on PC, and Soldat existed once upon a time. It doesn't now. Salem is a crafting MMORPG with permanent death, which almost automatically excludes a lot of players. So it's a very niche MMO. And Magica, although it has been a big success, is still very niche. And the same goes with the other titles we make. Just briefly, and I think it's important for you to understand this because it very much decides the mindset of Paradox, and it's important for you to understand that when I start talking about other people. Paradox games, whenever we find games, we want games that have high replayability, and we want them to have a high average playtime. And not in the sense that Dragon Age has, for instance, where you have a 100-hour campaign, essentially. But we want a game that you can come back to for dozens of hours, like with Zeal's new game, a Game of Dwarfs, for instance. And we also seek a long and aggressive post-release plan. Half of the adventure is just releasing the game and putting it in the hands of the gamers, and then listening to them and see what they want, and then giving them more of that stuff, essentially. And we focus on strategy, action, and RPG games, essentially. And finally, when I say PC games from now on, I mean open platforms. For me, it's the same thing. And open platforms is essentially a platform where we can make the product and deploy it without having to answer to anybody else. We don't have to jump through anybody else's hoop, and we don't need to get certified, and we don't need to get approval for this and that. It's our game, and we talk directly to the consumers. Okay, so let's get more general. What the hell does a publisher do anyway? This is a broad question, and so you can get your money from Kickstarter. You do you start selling it at pre-alpha or whatever, and you do a couple of cool viral videos, and people tweet and Facebook and I don't know, lunar storm it, and suddenly the game kind of has a life of its own, and the dough is just rolling in, right? so what does a publisher do? What's the entire deal? And this is something that I think it's good for people to know. And what publishers do is that they primarily fund game productions, but they also do the QA, the marketing. They help with localization, which is translating games into other languages. They age rate games. They help with focus testing, certification, help with development, and then do licensing. What most importantly, what a publisher does is sales. And they do sales through what's regular sales, but also through the previous things I mentioned. And I'm just going to do an example of how sales works and how publishers do it. I don't know, some people, for this is extremely self-explanatory, and for others it's very new, and it's very useful for you if you're going to do a self-publishing kind of path. So essentially, I usually have a whiteboard when I do this, but I'll do human gestures instead. We released a game called Europa Universalis in 2007. This is the pinnacle of all Paradox releases. Essentially, it's a grand strategy game, which you start playing as a country in Europe from the year any country in the world essentially from 1399 to 1839 or something, whatever. So it's very hardcore. And what we do is that when we release the game, we have a big sales spike, right? The game sells like crazy, and then it kind of falls off. And then we have a small sale, and then we get another peak, and then it kind of falls off. Then you do maybe a patch, and then a small peak, and then it drops off. And it's the normal curve for almost any game, and you do post-release stuff to keep it alive. Then we released an expansion. What happens with the sales curve? Again, it jumps up. And people also buy more of the original game. That also sees a jump up. And then you do the sales stuff again, and you lower the price and do sales and stuff, and you milk that for a while. And then it's time for another expansion, right? And this was almost a year and a half after release, and we were like, shit, people are still buying this game. Like, what's going on? And we did the sales, and we did the stuff, and we said, you know what? Since we have this much content now, let's bundle these together and make Europa Universalis 3 complete to end the series, right? We've got all the good stuff. You will never, ever need anything more. The original game costs $39.99. An expansion costs $19.99. So we put these together and just call it complete and sell it for $39.99. Perfect value. And we sell a shit ton of these. And the curve just goes up, and then it starts falling off, and we do the sales stuff, and then we do a patch, and then it starts dwindling off. But it's still selling. And why is it selling? Because we're still doing these like sales activities and participating in bundles and whatnot. And then, you know what? 2 years after release, people are still screaming for content. So what do? Another expansion. Because people want it. Also, we're making money, right? So we did another of those, and we see the entire thing again. And we're like, okay, we're pushing it 2.5 years. Let's do another expansion. We do another expansion, and all the time we're just putting all that together and giving players really great value. And pushing out through different bundles and in retail and whatnot. And then we're like, shit, what do we do now? We can't do Europa Universalis Complete 2. That would be stupid, right? So we call it Chronicles. It's stupid simple. It sounds stupid simple, but the hard part is getting those spikes and keeping it alive. And this in publishing is called long tail. And this is what Good Old Games is good at, and what they're helping the other shitty publishers do. And they're managing their extremely long tail. Essentially, Paradox and any other publisher today could just sit on their asses, not make another game, and just live happily ever after based off the long tail. This is if you do it correctly. So Paradox, which is focused very much on digital, decided, or I should say 4 years ago, we weren't focused on digital. We were like 70% retail. And then we realized, retail is just about as good as the plague. So let's stop doing that. And then we decided to focus over to digital. And last year, I think we were 94% digital. And if you check with other publishers, I think that Capcom said that they expect to be 50% digital by the year 2017, right? And I'll probably dip into why retail sucks so much, but it's really, really bad. The return of investment on retail is extremely bad. So this is the first tip I've got for you indie developers. Never, ever, ever, ever do retail. Never. And that doesn't mean that we're 92% digital, and that we don't do retail. But what we do essentially when we get a game like Magica, for instance, which is too cheap to actually sell in retail, is that you license it to a German publisher, Koch Media, for instance, because they love retail. So like, do whatever you want, just give us that $1.50 that you make from that, and who cares? And it's not our headache. And that's kind of what publishers do. And is this something you need? Do you need to do all these kind of things? Well, it kind of depends on what your goal is, and this is something that people touched upon earlier. And there are huge differences in what kind of tactics you want to pursue depending on what kind of goals you have as a developer. I mean, is your point to make a lot of money, to get your name out there? Do you want to be on a specific platform? Do you want to grow, have a 50 million users? Do you want to have 500 employees? What's the different goals? And most importantly, what do you want to do as a company or a game developer? I think a lot of us just started in the gaming industry because we had so many good ideas and we just wanted to make games. And then we realized that, shit, you need to do business and you need to do contracts. And like I heard 3 people say already, like, find somebody else who can do these things. And that's the second tip I have. It's one of the best things you could do. If you want to make games, then don't do business stuff. Find somebody else who can do that. And speaking from experience, we work with like 22 different development teams all around the world. The ones that do best is when they have a CEO that doesn't play games, that doesn't even care. It might sound weird, but taking that leap of faith is really smart. So, and that kind of comes back to the indie myth. What's indie? I'm not really going to go into that, but it kind of feels, and might be a Swedish thing, is that the poorer you are, the more indie you are somehow. It's almost like a straight correlation, because if you go for the money, if you sell out to the man, you're essentially also a corporate douchebag, and you're not indie. And like Notch is talking about, like, oh, we're not indie anymore, and EA is doing indie bundles, and everybody's just freaking out and stuff. And what people forget is that making games is a business. Like, the number 1 financier of game development in Sweden is, you know this, everybody's gotten money from them already. CSN. They're the number 1 backer. CSN is the student loan thingy in Sweden. Everybody's got like 200K in loans from CSN. They're the number 1 backer of game development in Sweden. Second, perhaps EA. But games is a business, and in Sweden, I'll go back with that. In Sweden, business is almost a dirty word. If you fly with an American airline, they say, once you've landed, they say, "We thank you for your business." You will never hear this on board a Swedish company. Never. Because business is a dirty word in Sweden. It actually kind of is. And this is somehow tied into the making games is art discussion that people are so preoccupied in Sweden. And it kind of gets muddled, the message that if you do games, it's art, then you can't do that with money. But at the same time, like, you could make the best game ever, but if nobody plays it, nobody buys it, it's not a game, essentially. So you have to remember that games is a business. And since it's business, you need money. And who has the money? Well, the publishers, essentially, or the banks, or venture capitalists, or hopefully you have a rich uncle who dies. And now we start getting to the part where we talk about signing with a publisher and what that essentially means. And I'll give you a quote, so I have time to drink water. It's also true the other way around. This is an actual quote, I'm not making this up. And he said this not knowing that I was in the room, and it was pretty funny. I've used it ever since. And it's very much true. It's really, really tricky signing with a publisher or just getting into a partnership. And that's something that Sebastian talked about earlier. And I'll get to that. So, Publishers and publishers. There's a huge difference between publishers, as there are huge differences between developers. And it's very true that most publishers are douchebags. And it's also true that most developers are douchebags. So what you have to do essentially is you have to find the non-douchey ones essentially. And that's pretty hard. So we've got a bunch of publishers here. Some do just marketing, some just do distribution, and some do both. And you kind of have to decide what's important for you. And because you probably want to run a different kind of development studio. Everyone has a different focus. And this comes back to what I said earlier. What's your focus? What do you want to do? Do you want to do business stuff? Do you want to make a shit ton of money? Do you want to make the best game? Do you want to get a develop award? Do you want to get like godlike status like the Mojang guys? Or do you just want to make a healthy, a fine living and just making the things you love every day, right? So there's a huge difference between these guys, and the differences are noticed in how they work, what kind of track record they have, how they treat their developers. I think that somebody mentioned contracts. We have some of I think in the Swedish industry, we have probably the Paradox contracts are maybe the thickest I've seen in the Swedish gaming industry, and they cover a lot of legal mumbo jumbo shit. A lot of shit that we could lose about 10 pages in that contract, and it would still be a good contract. While the Microsoft contracts I've read, for instance, are about 6 pages. But the amount of getting fucked over, quality factor in our contract and the Microsoft contract could vary. And it kind of depends on, so this contract might be much tougher, and this might seem nicer, but what happens when the going gets tough? Who'll screw you over the most? Who's gotten screwed over the most? And that's the kind of things that make a big difference, and that's why it's important to vet or really get to know whoever you're getting in bed with. And this is true for a publisher or a marketer or another developer. So you have to really know what kind of stuff they do. If you have a shooter game, a first-person shooter, you should probably not come to Paradox. You should probably not go to Nintendo either. But maybe Epic. What kind of track record do they have with their developers? Have they helped them out with funding? Have they cut the licensing fee for their engine, for instance? How have they treated their developers in the past? What happened to the old developers? Are they still working with them? Are they not? Ask other developers, how was that publisher to work with? Was it the producers that were the nice guys, or was it the board that actually helped you guys? Because a publisher essentially consists of multiple parts. And I think that almost everybody says that, like, working with the Microsoft producers are great, but then you have to deal with the Microsoft politics, and that's really another story, essentially. So I remember that before I started working in publishing, when I worked at Avalanche and different places, I remember that the publishers were just this huge black unknown space void. You didn't know exactly how they were thinking, what the motivation was, and it's very easy to see how that douchebag stigma came about, because you essentially don't know them, you don't understand them, you don't know what's what. And it was the same thing when we worked at Avalanche or different other companies, and we worked with different publishers. You heard stuff and you couldn't really understand, why do they want this, or what's the reasoning? It's clear for you that it's one way, but they don't get it. And I think that it is hard, because you haven't walked in their shoes, and it's really hard to understand, and the reasoning is wrong a lot of times. And we'll get to that. And the thing is that people don't. This is not something that's discussed readily. You'll never be taught how to negotiate a contract at a game development school, right? And the thing is that the problem is that people don't ask enough questions, and I do this myself. I have a shitload of questions I'd like to ask Microsoft, but I don't really ask them because I think that they'll get pissed or whatever. And I realized that was the same problem with developers, that they didn't ask us smaller publishers what was what. So I'll try to shed some light on this. We'll just flip over the fridge and just shine a light on these cockroaches for a while and just deal with some of the bigger questions. And these are the things that people generally just don't know, or I think that our previous talker mentioned this about royalty rates and what the console publishers take, for instance. So let's talk about making a deal with a publisher, and what I'll answer down the line is when should you come to a publisher with your deal, or when shouldn't you come to a publisher with your game to sign a deal. So essentially I'll talk about two different types of contracts, and somebody else already mentioned these. The first type is when the publisher takes the risk. Essentially when they upfront they give you the money and you give them a game. But they're taking the entire risk, financing the entire project. And this is, in many ways, the most standard deal because developers generally don't have money and publishers have money. And what this means is that they finance the entire game and the rub and the stub, like we see in Swedish. And the developer can expect maybe 10-30% royalties, depending on the risk. And this is recoupable by the publisher. And this also means that the publisher retains the IP, every piece of art, model, like every doodle you make on a post-it that essentially belongs to the publisher, because the publisher is fronting every single penny. And hopefully you'll make a game, deliver it on time. The publisher then hopefully does a great job of marketing and selling the game, and they make a shitload of money. And since they fronted all the cash, they'll see the majority of the money. And if you're lucky, you might see some money back. There might be alternate schemes, like we've heard, was it Obsidian? Guys made New Vegas, that they had if they had one more in Metacritic score, they would have gotten a huge bonus. This is a standard thing, that if you hit 90 or 85 or something, you get a bonus. And that's an alternate way of getting, seeing returns on the funds. But let me tell you a bit about royalties and bonuses. And this is a huge misconception for developers. They expect that, you know what, we'll make a good game and we'll then see royalties back. And this is something that you'll see a lot of times with publicly traded companies that go to their stockholders and say, you know what, we're making a kick-ass game based on an established franchise, we're going to make a shit ton of money. Starbreeze in Uppsala, for instance, this is what they've been saying at every stock meeting every year. And they will never, ever see a single penny in royalties on their games. And they have never, and they will never do that because of, yes? First Reddick, yes. But the subsequent ones, they won't see any money because this is generally how it works. And it's probably true that they got money, but they were probably entitled to more money. And essentially, this is how publishers do it. Since the money that the publisher invests is recoupable, which essentially says that, okay, let's say we invested 10 million in this game. So when the game has made 10 million, essentially when they've reached a break-even point where they're supposed to start giving royalties back to the developers, they'll essentially say that, you know what, let's spend 100,000 in marketing in Spanish retail. And then we get to recoup that ×3. Then we get to start paying the developer. This is essentially a part of every contract. It's even in our contracts. And each publisher has the full right to do so because they decide how to publish and market and sell a game. But essentially, a publisher has the power to make sure that the developer never sees an additional penny. They have the power. I'm not saying that this is done every time, but depending on the sizable return of investment, you see what happens. And there are numerous examples of big publishers screwing over developers over this. And what's Starbreeze going to do if they think that they're entitled to this much and that much? I mean, they're going up against a pretty huge publisher. And this is what's happening with Activision, for instance, with the Infinity Ward guys, that they saw a huge pool of bonus money that were supposed to be paid out, then shit started happening and they tried to downsize that. So expecting to get rich on royalties is perhaps one of the biggest pipe dreams ever. There are other models that make it more dependable on when you see return on investment. So, and that kind of comes back to what's the upside for the developer? What's in it for the developer to be a part of that deal? Well, if your plan is to see enormous return of investment through royalties, then perhaps letting somebody else finance a project isn't the best idea. And this is a discussion I've had a lot of times with a lot of developers that have been pissed at us because, you know what, you're getting all the money. And we're like, well, we spent all the money. And we'll get to that later, essentially. So, but it's the important question for each developer and for you guys is to determine what's important for you guys. What's important for you? Is it to make money off royalties or something else? And there's another side to that ugly coin, which is essentially that for some developers, their upside is not to see royalties, but that each check they get from the publisher at the end of each month is padded severely. So they make sure that they get a lot of money. So for some developers, they end up in a situation where the best way for them to make money is to never release a game. Because they keep getting money from a publisher, but they never, ever have to deliver. Essentially, they reach a point where the project has to get canceled because they're behind. But still, they've gotten so much money, so for them, it's not a big deal to have the game canceled. And there are a lot of companies that, for instance, have had numerous AAA projects canceled, but they're still alive. Some are not alive, like Grin, for instance. But Avalanche has had how many big releases since it was founded? 2? And it's been alive since, I don't know how many years, 10 years now, right? How is that even possible? So I'm not saying that this is a systematic thing that Avalanche does, but it's well within the capacity of a developer as well, depending on how much you pad your numbers, for instance. Okay, so the other kind of deal is the co-publishing deal. And the co-publishing deal is essentially when a developer says, you know what, my game is 100% complete. Here, take it, package it, sell it, QA it, just get it out of my way. I don't want to see it ever again. And just send me a check. And this is kind of how the music industry worked and how the word royalty essentially came about. The music artist had a product, gave it to the label, they sold it, and they got royalty checks. But the message kind of got fuddled when it was brought over to the gaming industry because are you entitled to royalties on a product that you didn't pay for or create yourself by your own means? But it's still called royalties. But essentially, a co-publishing deal, when we do them, you come to us, and this is fairly standard across the board. The publisher just takes the game, sells it, and the revenue is split 50-50. The developer retains full creative control, retains all the IP, and retains a lot of the stuff. And then that's essentially how it works. And it's fairly clean. It's not that complicated. You have basically a finished product. And I'll talk about why it's fairly clean. And what happens is that these are the two opposites essentially, and there's a fair bit of ground in between where you can compromise on different things. The publisher could, for instance, have a buyout clause that says that we can buy out the IP for this much money, for instance. And if you start looking at the different deals or the publishing, whatever is that going on, you see that they've essentially have different, it's either this one or that one. For instance, Remedy that made Alan Wake, they retained the IP rights, and that's why you can see it was licensed to Microsoft as an exclusive, but they retained the rights and released it themselves on PC because Microsoft didn't care about PC. And with Big Huge Games and 38 guys, the Kingdoms of Amalur guys, it's essentially the same, that the Rhode Island went in and funded the game, EA just published it. How many developers were let go? 200 something? 380. And the Twitterverse is just alive with trying to save these guys, and you haven't heard a peep from EA, who published the title, because they don't own the IP. They didn't pay a dime for the entire thing. They're just happy that somebody else paid for the game. We sold 1.22 million, and we're making the money back, and why should we care? They made bad business. So, and this is essentially where it gets sticky. Why do the conflicts arise between publishers and developers? And the thing is that it has a lot to do with the risk. The bigger project you do, the more money you need. The more money you need, you probably have to go outside to a publisher. And the more money they invest, the more protective they are of their money. So, and essentially, the bigger chunk of money you have, and then you have a bunch of people spending that money. And if the publisher is big and the developer is big, that essentially means that there's a fairly long distance between whoever made the decision to give the money and whoever's spending that money. And that distance creates distrust, and it makes it harder to work with each other. The less money you've invested, you're not as afraid to lose that money, essentially, and you're not as nervous. But if you spend a lot of money and you start seeing that deliveries are slipping or whatever is not performing, you become more nervous. The more nervous you are, the more control you want to exert. The more control you exert, the more frustrated the developer becomes. The more frustrated they become, they start looking for different ways to get out of the deal or having other upsides in the deal. So one of the things I want to talk about now is the value of money on what we talked about earlier, which was the upside and downside of having somebody else funding your game. So as a developer, you have to decide, and as a publisher also, you have to decide what do you want? Do you want somebody who just gives you money? Do you want somebody who gives you help with marketing? Or do you want somebody who helps you with QA and testing? Maybe that's something you want to do yourself. But what's important that you decide what's important for you and find a partner that matches that. But essentially, if you're asking for money, if you're telling somebody that this is our idea, we want your money, then don't expect to see a big part of the upside. Your upside, essentially what you end up in the plus column, is that you get paid, you get name recognition for making a game, and you can keep doing what you want, essentially. While the publisher's upside is that they have the chance to make a shit ton of money. And the reason for this is that, and this is something that gets lost in the shuffle, and this is the biggest difference that I've experienced when talking to younger developers, or I'd say more inexperienced developers, and people who've worked in the industry for 15 years. I have completely different discussions about the contracts. When we talk about our contracts with smaller developers, they start discussing a lot of the small stuff in the contract. And they're like, oh, this feels scary, and this feels scary, and this feels scary, and they talk about those stuff. And while the more experienced developers, the only thing that they're essentially interested in talking is making sure that their technology, whatever they're using, doesn't end up in the publisher's hands. They're perfectly fine with the fact that the publisher keeps all the contract is essentially there to protect the publisher. There's a huge difference in how money is perceived. Because when you worked in the industry for about a long time, you know how hard it is to get a hold of money. And you kind of know that what's more important is some of the other things. Because essentially, if you come to a publisher and say, hey, we need $2 million, and then you start making, and you get the $2 million, they decide to take a risk with you guys, and you start making a game, and then halfway through, or let's say you actually finish the game, which is hard in itself. You finish the game, it's released, and it sells nothing. Right? So what does that, let's just examine that for a moment. For the publisher, that means that they've spent $2 million on production, for instance, and they've spent marketing money and invested time and resources, and that's gone. They've essentially lost $2 million. What has the developer lost in that instance? They've lost, well, the time has been invested in, they've actually got a game that's finished. They've gotten a kind of recognition if that was their first game. They actually have a game to their name. But financially, aren't they in the same spot as they were the first day? What have they lost in that sense? A lot of times people don't agree with me when I say this. That what has the developer essentially lost in that sense? If we make a game for $2 million and it sells 0 copies, a hit on the reputation. And this is kind of the core of the matter, that if you ask people for money and they take the risk, you have to remember what kind of risk you're taking. What will happen to you if that game actually tanks? You can just go to another publisher and ask for more money. That's essentially what you did for the first time. The publisher gets to retain the IP, but if the game sold 0 copies, that IP isn't worth anything, right? And I'll just briefly touch upon the difference between the publishing mindsets. And generally, I think that all of us can see that there's a kind of paradigm shift that's been going on for the past years in the gaming industry, where we've seen that there's been a polarization in the gaming industry. AAA has just grown immensely, and suddenly AAA, Avalanche used to be AAA, Starbreeze used to be AAA, but you can't make AAA games with 80, 100 developers anymore. You have to be like 300, 600. Just look at Blizzard or the Assassin's Creed series or the Call of Duties. They don't have less than 200 developers working on those games, right? AAA has grown and is just something else, right? And at the same time, we've seen the free-to-play games, we've seen the Wii games that we don't hear so much about anymore, but the casual freemium. So we've seen kind of a polarization. And what's happened is that the middle road, what Cliff Bleszinski at Epic used to call the middle class, is dead, essentially. And this is exactly the same kind of BS they said about the PC. The PC is dying, blah, 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 blah. And let's just jump to that. It's exactly that same thing. And what's happened is that the middle ground is thriving. And middle ground, that's where PC is. That's where Steam is. That's where the 26 different digital portals are, right? That's where self-publishing is, essentially. So, what happens when you do a big AAA project is that you start with a backwards kind of mentality. You don't start by thinking, let's make a good game. You start by saying, we need to make a AAA game that sells $800 million. That's the target we have to hit, okay? Then they start thinking, okay, so what do we need to do to hit that target? Well, it probably has to be a shooter. It probably has to be in a modern setting. It has to have multiplayer. And they start backtracking from that 800 target until they boil it down to, okay, it has to be this kind of game. And essentially, when you start there, you know that this is the objective. If we don't hit that, it's a disaster. Like with Kingdoms of Amalur or whatever. It's selling 1.2 million. It's a great number, but it's nowhere near enough. Old Republic. Everybody's talking about how a big failure it is, even with the Star Wars brand, and it had like 1.8 million subscribers. Because the targets are so huge, you have to do some kind of backwards engineering. When you're in the middle, or when you do smaller stuff, you have way more freedom. And the mentality that Paradox has, or some other publishers have, is that we never ever, whenever somebody comes to me with a pitch, and we start looking at the game, and we never ever ever ask us the question, how much money could this game make? That's the last question we ask. What we ask is, what's the worst case scenario? What's the most money we could lose off of this project? Now, this is what we did with when Zeal came to us. I think the 2 games that they pitched us, we probably never spent that little time looking at game design. I don't know how long that Starvoid meeting was, but I don't know. We didn't even, the design was fine. We understood pretty much early on that was a game design that worked, and we trusted the guys because they had made a couple of games before. What we did instead was we looked at the budget, and we didn't say, okay, what happens if we sell 500,000 copies? Instead, we looked at the numbers and said, okay, for a Dwarfs game like this, by this studio, the worst case scenario, that's might just sell 10,000 copies. And then we're like, can we take that hit? Yeah, we probably can. Okay, so let's do it. And then we never look at the upside. And that's essentially how Magica came about. And that's how our entire publishing business unit came about. And that's why you see games that maybe don't have the best quality always. But we've managed to grow immensely by doing much smaller games. Not by looking at the upside, by looking at the bottom. And that's kind of how we get games that are fairly high on innovation. Because we're not shoehorned into a segment where we have to hit specific targets. And these are the kind of questions that you have to ask yourself and what's important for you and when you work with a publisher. I talk with, there are several game incubators in Sweden, and I talked to one of the organizers and I said, so what kind of help do the kids get when it comes to the business side? And they said, well, we have a couple of guys that help out, and they're great. And I said, oh, why are they great? And they said, well, they're so connected. They're one of the few guys in the Swedish game industry that can lift up the phone and make sure that the 8-man student team gets a meeting with Warner Brothers. And I didn't say anything, but I was like, why in hell would 8 students with a shitload of creativity and a bunch of fine ideas would want to talk with a super big publisher like Warner Brothers? All that's going to get squandered, right? They're not cared about the innovation in that sense. They look at another kind of set of numbers. And I'm not saying that Warner Brothers is wrong for you. You probably have a really good Batman game that they would love to make. But generally, how many of you have Batman concepts lying around right now? Yeah. So, I'll skip a bit. I'll delve into quickly designing games for profitability. And this is something I was asked specifically to talk about, so I just put it in there. And this is very much colored by my PC experiences, seeing what sells on Steam and what doesn't. And having games that have a high degree of replayability is something that you see being good in a game. And I'm not saying that you should purely design a game so it makes money, but having these kind of things in your game will probably make it easier to make money. Replayability, like we say, see games like Minecraft, which has infinite replayability. Europa Universalis, Left 4 Dead. These are the kind of games where you want to come back and do things over and over and over again in different ways. Right? Modularity. And this is the core thing for me when it comes to game development. One of the best qualities of software development across the board is that you can iterate. You can do something, you can go back, visit it, change it, do it again, change it more slightly, go back and just do it over and over and over and over again until it's one polished fucking diamond, right? When you do a huge project, and huge could be like a year for you, or it could be 3 years for Ubisoft, for instance. Essentially, you have to start planning, and then you have to try to plan ahead for a very long time perspective. And it's very hard to be flexible and iterative and exploit those strengths in software development if you're building a big, huge chunk of a game. Not everybody's Blizzard and has infinite money, can spend time iterating games. And so it's fairly hard. But if you build your game in modules, which essentially means that you build a core portion of your game, you start selling it, you start talking to your fans and listen to what they have to say. And do they respond well to the PvP part? Do they like the story content? Do they want to see more hats? Do they want to see more progression? And you give them what they want. So essentially, over a 3-course period, you'll end up with the same product that you would have built during those 3 years, but you've instead given players what they asked for and not what you were guessing they wanted. And there's a huge difference. So try to build games in chunks that go well together. And that's essentially this third point as well. And the fourth one is what I showed you with the Europa Universalis thing, that design a game for the long tail. I'm not saying that like Dear Esther or The Journey are games that won't sell. But I'm saying that there are a lot of games like The Journey or Penumbra or those games, or Amnesia, that are focused 3-hour experiences that don't take off, essentially, because they don't have that kind of replayability. And yeah. Briefly about this, I touched upon this. A lot of people come to us and they pitch a game and they're saying, yeah, we want to make this game, and in order to reduce risk, we'd like to release this game for PC, Xbox, and PS3. And I'm like, what do you mean reduce risk? And they say, well, the bigger audience we reach, the less risk we take, right? I'm like, no, that's not right, because that means that you have to spend more money to reach that kind of audience. Making a game for several platforms is a nightmare. Making a game for one platform is challenging enough. You want to make it for 3 platforms, especially when 2 of those are controlled by somebody else, where you can't patch games, essentially. And I don't have time to get into the specifics of how bad console retail is. Maybe you can cover it in a question if somebody really wants to know. But it's very costly, it's very difficult, and it additionally removes all the additional advantages of doing software development. You can't be flexible. You want to patch a game on the Xbox? Well, that's going to cost you $25,000. You can't patch as much as you want unless you're Mojang and have a special kind of relationship with Microsoft. But nobody else essentially has that. Fez, which sold immensely well, were bitching and moaning because there was some kind of extra communication going on between Mojang and Microsoft. And that's not the only example. Patching games on consoles is just impossible, in the same sense that PC is. And that's not to say that Sony and Microsoft are not good partners in that sense. A lot of people have done really, really well. But you have to be aware of their strengths and weaknesses. What kind of game are you making? Is that more suitable for PC? Is it more suitable for console? So that's, again, you have to know what kind of game you're getting into, and don't do several platforms in order to reduce risk. The minimum risk you're taking is when you have complete control and can just put it out yourself. Either through Steam, which you essentially can't unless they permit you, or you sell it through your own website. That's the least bit risk. Small means less risk. I'll actually delve into something else that I was asked to talk about, to how do you pitch a game to a publisher, and when do you pitch a game to a publisher. And this varies a lot, but this is essentially the entire life cycle of what happens when you come up with an idea on a napkin until it's released and you make money or don't make money. And we'll just go through these phases fairly fast. Essentially, you start with a pitch, right? It should be short and sweet. The first one, at least. Okay? Don't get into messy details about how the story of the backstory of the game was. The backdrop is an interstellar war between 2 brothers that fought over the same diamond. Blah, blah, blah. Don't get into that. Keep it short and sweet. And I'll actually give you a concrete example from one of the formats that I kind of stole from Avalanche. I hope Christopher doesn't learn of this. I stole this from Avalanche, and I've seen a lot of other similar pitches. This is a game called Shoot, which is, I think it's a 6-page document. It has a high concept portion, a big image, not that much text, more images, key features, more about the key features, look and style, DLC potential. It has a complete section just covering how to make more money off the game. And then an overview of how much it costs, other games that look similar. And this is essentially the ideal pitch in a lot of ways. It's short and simple. It'll get the message across. It's not too long to read. And if the publisher is interested, they can tell you more. This is essentially when the only thing you have is an idea. If you actually have a demo or more, that's even better. But let's start talking about the bare minimum, because everybody in here probably has a really good idea, right? Yes? You do? Okay. So, And you could get much more in depth from here, but this is a good start. And this essentially became the showdown effect down the line. Yes, Kaifa.
How many students or developers approach you with just a pitch, and how many of those is actually getting funded?
We get about 20, 30 pitches a month, perhaps, depending on. It varies a lot, but a lot of pitches. Half of them are in this state, essentially. Half of them are more finished products. And out of those, we make roughly 15, 20 games every year. So not many. And that's essentially how it is. You can come to a publisher with just an idea on a napkin, okay? But the big secret, or it's not actually secret, but ideas are worth almost nothing because everybody has a good idea. What's extremely valuable is the ability to deliver a product and deliver it on time. That's something that's very rare and very few developers actually can do. So don't fall in love with your own idea because they're a dime a dozen, essentially. It's never too early to come to a publisher, and it's never too late either. And it very much depends on what kind of deal do you want to make. Do you want funding for your entire project, or do you just want somebody who can take the game and put it through the final stretch? So that was one of the questions I was asked specifically to answer. When do you approach a publisher? A lot of times I know that developers sit on the stuff and they don't know when to approach it. Should we make a trailer based off the pre-alpha footage, or should we wait until it's later? Yes?
Yeah, we can ask you questions.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so about that, what do Paradox demand from a developer that wants to retain IP and technology?
That you fund it yourselves.
So
No, if you want money from us, you should be prepared to give something significant back. So I think that it would absolutely be an option that you retain the IP, but don't expect to get a single penny, for instance. But it's essentially, at least I'm speaking for myself now, but it's never too early to come to me and show me, okay, so this is our idea. We just want to show it to you, and then 3 months later you show me, okay, this is the first prototype, and then here's the beta and alpha, and it's done. And I might decide any time during that process that we want it. And it's essentially the same with other publishers, but you have to be wary that if you hound publishers too much, they might dismiss your game outright. But it's important to ask publishers to be very honest. Sometimes you get a no and you don't get a proper answer why it's a no. There could actually be nothing wrong with the pitch. They just say it's not good because it's not a good time for us, or your lead designer is not somebody that we have confidence in, for instance. Okay. So, boring but important, the due diligence. And this was something that was discussed during the panel, one second. And I touched upon earlier that once you start talking with a publisher, or actually before you start talking to a publisher, do some kind of due diligence. And this essentially means do your research. Do not come to Paradox with a pitch for a Nintendo DS music puzzle-based rhythm game with cute graphics. It's kind of like coming to an interview and not knowing what the company does, essentially. It's that bad. And you'd be surprised how many Facebook social games I get pitches for every week. Yes? Yeah, sure.
So if the developer has a finished game for, say, 80%,
Yeah.
I put you a slide here recently where it wasn't discussable.
Yeah. So the question is, what happens if you come to a publisher and have a fully finished game or almost a finished game? What could happen, what happens a lot of times, that we get a great game, and then we're like, so have you integrated Steam? And they say no. And we're like, why? Why haven't you integrated Steam? And they're like, well, Steam said no to us. And this is something that I can tell you that's new. A year ago, nobody asked us the following question. Can you get us on Steam? This is a question we never ever got before. Then suddenly, people started asking this, and we're like, what? And then it turned out that Steam is actually saying no to a lot of people, and this is something that's being discussed on forums and on places. And Steam is saying no because a lot of people are coming to them, and they don't have the capacity to handle a shitload of developers, and also it doesn't make sense for them to put any kind of crap game in there. So a new question we are getting is that, can you get us on Steam? And we have a really good working relationship with Steam, so for us it's like a huge surprise. So they come to us and tell us the game is finished, and we're like, okay, so what about Steam achievements? Why don't we have that? And Steam Cloud, for instance, or Steam anti-cheat, stuff that we think that would be really good for the game that would make it sell more. And essentially, you do some additional development. You do that with your own money, or you could do that with our money. But the essential idea is that the more money we risk, the more of the upside we want. And it's kind of hard to say what the cutoff point is for when the publisher wants the IP, or when they want the sequel rights, or when they want the different stuff. But it's always negotiable. You can always discuss it. And this is something that I've noticed, that people are like, you say something and they're like, well, okay, no, then bye. And instead of, you got to haggle, right? It's like in Life of Brian. You have to haggle, essentially. And don't be afraid of asking, so what do we need to do in order to be able to retain the sequel rights, the IP rights, and the whatever rights? So be vocal and ask publishers about this. Oh, absolutely. Oh, for Paradox at least. If you're making a game on PC and you're not considering Steam, I'd ask you why, because that's a big sign of trouble for me, essentially. Right, so it's all very negotiable. And these are the kind of things that are important in that sense, that you have to know what the publisher, how did they handle that failed game, or what did they do with this game? Did they give this shooter more attention? How much marketing are they intending to spend? Somebody talked about a lot of problems arising over marketing spend. And you have to try to figure out what they want. And we've spent less time talking about the concepts and talking more with the developers about, so what did you not like in Arkham Asylum? Like, why don't you like Diablo 3? What are the problems with the loot system in Diablo 2 compared to number 3? What's fine with the placement matches in the StarCraft League and stuff? What works for you and what doesn't, when it makes sense for your game? Because these are the kind of questions that will become important when the shit hits the fan. And things will hit the fan whenever you're working with another partner. Things will get rough. However you twist and turn it, there are no perfect relationships, because there's always friction. And when friction arises, it's less about, okay, what's the cooldown timer on the commander unit in Starvoid? And it's more about, so what do you guys as a company as a whole feel is a good way to pursue this or that? What's your long-term goal? So one of the questions that generally, and I think that this is a fairly good idea. You should not sign with a publisher unless you intend to work with that publisher for several more games. Don't do a one-off deal, because it's essentially like hiring any new personnel. The first month, that person is probably doing no good whatsoever, right? And it's the same with game development. The first game you do, that's when you do all your mistakes. With the second and third game and fourth game, that's when you start discussing the same asinine issues. You're getting ahead. So you have to make sure that you're answering the right questions. And again, just a second, that when we saw the concepts for Dwarfs and Starvoid, we discussed it very little. I think the guys talked about how frustrated they were with StarCraft 2, that the matches were either you rape him or he rapes you, and there's no in between. And what happened to the fun, get into the matches, just play some and get out. Essentially the fun gameplay that you find in Counter-Strike or Modern Warfare and have the kill streaks and stuff. And they said, essentially, we want that, we want an RTS, and we want abilities and kind of a look inspired or a feel inspired by Dawn of War. And I played all 3 games and I said, you know what, this is perfect. We don't even need to talk more about this. So we spent more time talking about, okay, so where's Zeal going the next 3 years? What's their target? And it's very good to be upfront and clear and say, you know what, we want your money now, but our intention as a developer is not to work with you in 5 years. Be very upfront about that, because that really helps me, because then we can move in the same direction and we can work together. And that's something you should talk to your other publisher or partner about. What kind of journey are we going to do the next few years together, and what aren't we going to do? Because what happens is that in Sweden it's called sitta på samma sida av bordet. Essentially, you're sitting on the same side of the table and you're moving in the same direction. The scariest situation for me is when we're working with a developer that has a separate project that we don't have anything to do with. So essentially, we're funding one project, and they have 30 developers, and they have a second team that's working on something separate that they're selling through their own store, through their alpha scheme. That's pretty scary for me. It would have been much better if I knew up front that they were planning to do that, and we could plan accordingly, and we could work according to those premises. In the same sense, we as a publisher need to be very upfront and say, you know what? We're probably going to spend more money on War of the Roses than Starboard. And be upfront about that, so Zeal doesn't get really pissed that we spend more money on Magicka or give Magicka more attention. You have to be upfront about these kind of things. And then things change, of course, but you have to be kind of honest about them. And set expectations right, so you know what kind of journey you're starting on. We had a couple of questions that I skipped, yeah? Yeah, I don't want to toot the Paradox horn too much, but I'm doing it. What we've noticed that we work a lot with first-time developers, partly with this naturally during the course of becoming a publisher because they are cheaper. So we've noticed that a few years ago, or I noticed a year ago, that, you know what, we're only working with first-time developers. That's essentially what we're doing. And we're kind of good at it. We know what kind of questions developers are asking. And we're dealing with the same kind of problem. So that's kind of become our niche in a sense also. But it's extremely, extremely, extremely hard. Like, we have a lot of problems with our, helping developers hit their marks and trying to not make these standard mistakes. And it's very tricky. Kaifa? Yeah. So it's very important about being upfront and like tell the publisher, like, you know, this clause in the contract, it scares the living shit out of us because of this reason. There's a question over there? Yes. Okay, the question is, releasing a game with Paradox that is a multiplayer game, how are the costs handled, how are the logistics handled for the server side of things? So far, it's been very pragmatic. In those cases, the developer wanted to do it, they've done it, and then we've done the things that we've been required to do, for instance. So, and this very much depends on, yeah, it's whatever is best for the game. But you have to decide that up front, so you're not just there like, yeah, so the game is released now, so start paying for the servers. That's a problem. But essentially, the more the publisher, if Paradox spends more on the servers, then we expect more of the upside. It's fairly easy in that sense. But this is, again, most publishers are very pragmatic, and you can always talk to them about stuff. Just make sure you do it before you get in bed. Yes? In my opinion, delivering on time. This is something that developers and first-time developers have an extremely, extremely hard time doing. And they can deliver on time, but that means that quality suffers as a result. And it's very important to know what kind of quality you want to hit. And it's really hard hitting your targets. Very few developers can do that, and they can charge a premium for delivering on time and on quality. It's very hard. So that's essentially the biggest challenge. Any other questions on that? Okay, contract. We discussed this before. I just want to cover it again. Somebody said, get a lawyer to read the contract. That's very good advice. Okay, but what you have to make sure is that you don't come back and say, you know what? This contract sucks because it only covers your ass. Then I would return the question and say, so what are you risking? How much of this project are you funding? If you're not risking anything, if you're not paying a single dime of development, why should the contract cover your ass? You're not taking any risk. The contract is there to protect the one that takes the biggest risk. And this is a huge point. I've had maybe, I don't know, 50% of the deals that we start negotiating and then it just implodes is because this question. They look at the contract and are like, well, we can agree to this. And we're like, well, we have to protect the investment. If things go south, this is what we'll do. This is how we'll protect ourselves. This is how we'll protect our 2 million crowns that we're investing in you guys. If we're not risking money, those kind of things can be negotiated. Yes? So, the question was regarding the risks and how you cover your asses as a publisher. And this could be the other way around. If you were giving subcontracting, sending out outsourcing materials or whatever, you need to cover your asses essentially. So what happens in a contract when a publisher has funded everything and they want to cover their asses? Essentially, there are what you can do in the worst case scenario, you can demand every penny back. And this is generally hard for developers to do, especially small developers like yourself, because you don't have a lot of extra cash lying around. If you had, you probably weren't talking to us in the first place. So that means that you can't pay that back. Essentially, you've spent that as salary during the process. So what happens then is that the publisher can say, you know what, that IP that belonged to you, well, it now belongs to us. Or give us what you can give us. But the harsh reality is that working with smaller developers is that if shit hits the fan, and we've had projects that have, like a studio has imploded. The lead guy, the CEO quit. The second founder, he also quit, and then we're left with no leaders. Basically, they have been late on 2 milestones, and essentially, what can we do? We can't get the money back. We can get a fourth of the project back, just source materials and a barely working first prototype. That's worth nothing to us. But essentially, the studio goes under. But then again, I have to ask you, if you're 8 guys and that happens and we take everything you have, even your post-its, where does that leave you? In the same space you are right now as a student. You have nothing, right?
Yeah, but that's what I was thinking about, because you can't take more.
No. No, absolutely not. No. It's not a dystopian like Highlander 2 kind of a nightmare where we can own you and put you in labor camps for the rest of your lives. It's not that. The worst thing that can happen is that you go bankrupt and you probably tarnish your reputation in the industry for a long time. That's as bad as it gets, essentially. No, but it actually, that's fine. But there's another thing. And this is really bad. And this is something I fear. And the developers that have experienced this can probably tell you. One of the scariest things you can lose as a game developer is your love for games. And this can actually happen. Like, I've heard so many developers that have been like, don't get into game development, get a job at ICA. It pays better, the hours are better, you get treated with respect, you can still go home and play games and you have fun, and you generally don't hate yourself. So it can definitely happen. So there are other downsides. So I can't stress the second part enough. The contracts are there to protect the ones taking the risks. And the contracts can be really thick and a bitch to get through, or they can be pretty slim. But ultimately, it depends on who you're writing that contract with. How do they treat the guys or gals that don't fulfill on their part of the contract. It's a huge difference. And like I said, the Microsoft contracts are much thinner, but I haven't signed one yet, and I'll leave it at that. I don't know why I wrote milestone schedules there. Right. And then we have production. And this is the easy part, right? Making games. And this is essentially how a publisher works. Some publishers demand milestones all the time. Sometimes they contact the developer over Skype and say, I need to build like right now, which I did like 2 times last week. But otherwise, it's generally these milestones that you have to hit. The vertical slice is something that's, for some, it's a given, and for others, it's very new. And who doesn't know what a vertical slice is? It's okay if you don't know. Oh shit, it's really good that I tell you that. A vertical slice is, it's if you take a osthyvel and you slice a perfect slice of the game vertically. Okay? It essentially contains all the parts of the game that you would find during a 2-minute session of the game. So essentially, you can play through the entire sequence. Let's say it's Grand Theft Auto. You can hijack a car, you can get into a car, you can drive a block, there are civilians there, they're walking around, you can get out and you can shoot. But once you pass that block, there's nothing there. You can't do advanced maneuvers and stuff, but it gives you an idea of what that game would be during those brief moments. And that also means that those moments are polished. And this is sometimes called first playable or vertical slice, or sometimes the prototype is really polished, and that's the vertical slice. But essentially allows you and whoever's playing the game to get an understanding of, okay, if this, extend this moment into 40 hours, and that's the full game, essentially. It's very tricky to do for some games. It's very easy to do for other games, essentially. But it contains the core mechanics. And you can show people that this is what the game would be like. And you can actually take that to shows, for instance. The showdown effect, for instance, that we showed at GGC, it had a really sweet vertical slice. It looked awesome. It looked badass. It had the weapons, customization. But besides that, there's like nothing in the game. It's just not there. It's not something you can sell. And the vertical slice is something that publishers use during, you expect to deliver this, a third or halfway into the project, and it'll be one of the first moments where a publisher says, you know what, we believe in this or we don't. It's a really good thing. Yes, Mats? Yes. What he said was that from a developer standpoint, it's also really good to help you plan the project, because it allows everybody to get a sense of, okay, this is actually what we're building, because I can tell you these are one of the things that's very challenging for games. I don't know, during development of Just Cause 2, how many times did people ask themselves, what the hell is this kind of game we're making, right? And ultimately, it ended up being good because of the grappling hook, but that wasn't one of the core features in the sense that you could do all those crazy stuff. It kind of matured during the process. It was a huge part of it, but it kind of came about. And that's why the vertical slice is really important. And it also gives you ways to estimate how long does it take to actually make a gun, because we made a gun instead of making half of the game and then you're like, okay, let's start making the guns, and like, oh shit, they take 5 weeks each. Yes? No, absolutely not. The contrary. There's nothing worse than when the developers say, so we're developing our own technology. That's like, okay, bye, fuck you, goodbye, never see me again. The last thing you want to pay for is tech development. So that's like, I think the third general tip I have. Programmers, do not make your own technology. You're like, I know you love making code. Don't. Ever. Use somebody else's. They're smarter and better than you. it breaks your hearts. But you can make your own engine in 10 years, right? Don't make it now. So I love nothing more than when somebody comes to me with an established engine. One word on the UDK. The UDK is good in a lot of senses if you're making a shooter, but it's bad in a lot of business cases because I, as a publisher, will probably never ever pay those the ginormous licensing fee that I have to pay, because I'll say, you know what? Why are you making it that engine? I don't need a game that is that pretty, because pretty games aren't the main focus for Paradox. But if you go to another publisher where you know they want pretty games with like excellent specular maps on their guns, well, probably the UDK engine is a good thing. But keeping costs down is a good idea, and UDK is not the perfect way. Then you say, well, I can use their license thing. They only take like 15% or whatever. The thing is that that's fine if you give away a portion of your cut. But don't expect the publisher to give Epic a slice of the publisher cut. Right? For me, it's like, why should I pay Epic money for a license? Like, I'm not interested in that. But then again, I'm interested in keeping costs down. If you're making a huge budget game, then the Unreal license isn't that big. So Unreal, fine. Unity, even better. Other established engines, also good. Your own tech, forget about it. The alpha and the beta, I think these you know fairly well. Make sure that you have plenty of time in between each ones, and make sure that you and the publisher both agree on the definitions of said milestones. They could vary greatly. Right. Kind of have a summary slide here. The first thing you need to ask yourself before you work with game development in general, and you start doing this, is that what are your goals? Do you want your own studio? Do you want to make a name for yourself? Do you want to make a lot of money? Do you want your own company? Do you want to make the coolest game ever? Like something I discussed with the guys in the jury, and they are very much jaded by the Swedish gaming industry, since they've been fired like 5 times over and seen just about every kind of horror story you would like to see. Death marches and late night snacks and stuff like that. Like, don't start your studio right now. If you really want to do your own studio, I would actually recommend you to wait 5 years, 10 years. You'll have a better studio. You'll have a better experience. That's Matt's tips, at least. He says, how many years have you been working in the industry now? 7. And he says, in 3 years, maybe he's ready to start his own. Maybe. So that would be another tip for me, that, you know what? You don't need to start your own studio if you don't want to be a CEO. Join another studio. Work for somebody else. Learn the ropes. But you have to ask yourself, what are my goals? What's the studio's goal? And you need to be really clear about this and not just jump into bed just because you can. When you start talking to another party, when you're signing a deal, you need to really ask yourself, what are you willing to give up to reach those goals? What is it you're prepared to not do? What are you prepared to part with? The IP, the control, and essentially what are the things that are less important for you? Then secondly, what's important for you to not give up? What are the things that you won't compromise about? You have to ask these questions and be very honest with yourself. One thing I'd like to add regarding control and the contract is that, and I should have mentioned this before when it came to the publisher slide, is that there's a huge difference in publishers when it comes to how they let you work. And this is something that reflects back from you developers. Generally, developers get really pissed when the publisher has opinions about the game design, right? When publisher says, well, the main character's hair should be this way, or we won't pay you money. This happened at Avalanche, for instance. When the publisher has game design ideas, well, the grappling hook reload time should be blah, blah, blah. Developers get really pissed. They don't know anything about game development, so they should just shut the fuck up. The most annoying thing is when the publisher brings in an expert They're supposed to tell you what's good with your game or not. Okay? Almost every developer balks at this, right? But on the other hand, what's fairly more accepted is that developers have opinions on how the publisher markets and sells the game, right? This is much more okay, right? Well, why does the cover art look like this? And why is the pricing like this? And why isn't there and there? Blah, 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 blah. So what happened here? Suddenly it's okay for developers to be pissed at the publisher for meddling in the design, and when they start picking the developers' nose apart and telling them what to do. But when the developer starts talking about how to market a game, which last time I checked, you're not the publisher, so why are you talking about that? So this is the kind of discrepancy that we see a lot of the times, and we talk a lot about. And you have to talk to the publisher and see what kind of publisher are they? Are they going to do this? Maybe it's fine for you that they get involved. Maybe they have one of the best vehicle designers in the world. Of course you want that person's feedback. But at the same time, you have to be clear about these things, right? I think few publishers would stand for a developer that gets involved in the marketing side, unless that's something you agreed upon. And for Paradox's sake, and this is the small sales pitch, since we're so small, we can't do the ginormous kind of marketing production apparatus. So when it comes to the cover art for a lot of our games, we actually start by asking the developer, do you want to make the cover art? And if they want to make it and if they have the time, they actually get to make it. And so those are the kind of things that we're pretty upfront about, and saying that we'll use you extensively in the marketing materials. We'll send you to E3, or you have to participate in this. Sometimes the developer doesn't want to be a part of that. But these are the questions you have to ask yourself. And again, these are the differences between publishers. One of the things that Paradox also has done extensively, for good and bad, has been letting the developers do more or less what they want when it comes to the design. And this gives developers a great degree of freedom, and I think you described it as that we haven't, with Dwarves, for instance, one of the things that we've discussed more is that, okay, should we do this platform? Should we do this Steam feature? Should we do the broader topics? But I don't think that anybody's ever had an opinion about the Dwarves anything, anywhere. So, and that's again, that's maybe something that's important for Zeal. And it's not important for us. Because from my perspective, it's important that I trust the developers to make a great game, and they trust us to do great marketing. And if that trust doesn't exist, there's no point in making a game. I can give you a perfect example of what happened between us and Arrowhead. They were about to release an expansion for Magica, which was called The Stars Are Left. They sent us a bunch of concept art that wasn't meant for publication. So what happened was that I messed up and didn't tell marketing that they couldn't use the assets, and they used it anyway. And Arrowhead naturally became pissed because their concept art, which in my eyes and marketing eyes was perfectly fine, was shown to the public, and they were pissed because it was ugly in their eyes. So what happened after that was that they stopped sending us concept art. We just noticed that we were not getting any more concept art. And the other week I was by the Arrowhead office, and I saw that, you know what, they have gorgeous concept art for the showdown effect. Why haven't I seen this? And then we're like, well, you just mess up again. Or so we'll give it when we're good and ready. So I wrote them an email and said, guys, we messed up that time. That was our fault. But this is not the way to solve the problem. If you don't trust us to do right when it comes to the marketing, then we shouldn't be making any games at all. Let's address the core issue then, instead of trying to find different ways of working around each other. So they had a very natural reaction. And this is what happens. And when you're in the trenches and doing hard work, you don't always have the calm to think about problems in a constructive manner. They just did what their gut reaction told them to do. Make sure that the wrong concept art didn't get out. So these are the kind of things that you need to discuss, yes? What happened was that I said that there are numerous things we can do. we've changed our routines in-house to make sure that that doesn't happen, for instance. No. Since then, they've clearly labeled, this is so like specific, they've labeled the folder, they labeled the files, they've sent emails to specific departments, and then we make sure that the files are in the right location. Like, this is so not exactly specific. So what won't you give up? And then, what are your weaknesses? What are you bad at? What aren't you good at? What don't you want to do? Are you good at project management? Are you good at making concept art, 2D art, menus, rendering? What are your weaknesses? And also ask the publisher. Like, Paradox has a lot of weaknesses. We're fairly small, mid-sized publishers. We don't have the same kind of reach and power that Blizzard does, for instance. We have a lot of strengths and we have a lot of weaknesses. So does the developer. So you have to match those and make sure that you play off each other well. And but you have to be aware of your weaknesses, because going into a project saying, you know what, we haven't delivered in a project, but we're really good at project management, it's just not realistic. And perhaps maybe you shouldn't decide what your weaknesses are. Maybe ask somebody else that isn't the publisher. This is really hard. I'm saying it's like it's an easy thing, but it's not. Our weakness is that we like I said, we trust the developers that they'll do the right decisions, that they'll prioritize the right features instead of making the game stable, for instance. Or we trust that the amount of marketing we do will be enough, or the QA we do is enough. Like, Paradox QA traditionally has been horrible, right? Our games are buggy and broken at launch, and we're working hard on that. And people know this. This is not a big surprise. We won't ever tell you that, you know what, our QA department is the best, and your games will be the most solid, stable games ever. And you have to be upfront about those things, and you have to be upfront about everything. But make sure you talk about these things with the publisher. And finally, the most important thing is that you have to make good games. And it sounds easy, but it's not. Yeah, I essentially don't have that much more. I'd love if you contact me if you have additional questions right now, or through email, I think it's correct, or Twitter, or whatever. I mean, 4 years ago, I was basically in your seat, and I remember that whenever I had a lot of questions, but I didn't have anybody to ask those questions. So feel free to ask me questions. And the Swedish game industry is a very small industry. I think we have about 1,200 people that work in the industry, but we have about like 400 students that graduate every year. There's a tremendous amount of potential that gets lost because there aren't enough entrepreneurship and new companies getting started and people doing right stuff because they're not asking the right questions. So, like, we've talked with the Might and Delight guys several times, and we talked about doing the game together, and we said, you know what, this is not a game for Paradox because it doesn't cater to our 35-year-old single living with his mother male guy. Right? But it's a great game, and I've talked with Wendy several times about different business stuff, and I'd be happy to help out with suggestions and ideas based off my experience. Yes? Yes? Yes, I mean, I don't talk that much with other publishers per se, but I can tell you, like, talk with Focus. They're good at this, or talk to Reverb. They did a great job with this and that. But absolutely, I can point you in the right direction, or give you my two cents on the game. But essentially, I've had like student teams that have come to me like at a really early stage, and they show me, this is our game. We don't want you to buy this, but we're just showing it to you, and they just do it every 3 months, and we're in the loop, and like you build relationships and networks in that sense. And try to be honest and brutal with each other. Yes? 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 Okay. The questions are, the first question is, who controls the monetization strategy? And the second one is, when people's pitch, do they have a monetization strategy, and what happens then? The first, I think the answer for both questions is that a developer makes a game and a publisher sells a game. So the answer is the publisher. And that's essentially, if the publisher doesn't have a monetization strategy for the game, if they're not doing that for you, then you shouldn't be talking to a publisher. Then that's not the publisher for you. If you have one for yourself, then you're not looking for a publisher. A lot of people, we've stopped working with some developers because we've noticed that, you know what, they don't want a publisher, they just want a bank. And a lot of people ask me, and I'm digressing, but people ask me, so are you concerned about this Kickstarter thing, blah, blah, blah? And I was like, no, because Kickstarter does one thing, and that's money. We do 5 things, and money is one of them. The day Kickstarter can do marketing, distribution, sales, and QA, and localization, and talk to the community, and build a fan base, when it does all that, then I'm out of a job. But that's not what's happening today. And yeah, so monetization, the publisher should do it if that's the kind of publisher you're working with. But if you're not, then that's not a publisher, that's a marketer. And some people, I think that you guys are doing that. You have a game, it's ready, you've self-funded it, and you're working with partners who'll help market the game. But you could come to us essentially saying, we just need marketing. And we'll say, maybe, maybe not. For your second question, I always want to see proactivity from the developers when it comes to the business side. How are we going to make money off of this game? What's the DLC we're selling? What are the features we're giving away? It's really good for developers to be proactive with this, but have an open mind. Like, the problem is when being clueless isn't necessarily bad, but if somebody, I love to see a DLC portion in each pitch. If the game does well, we can do this, or this, or this. So I can at least see that they're planning ahead for selling hats or whatever is important for your game. I'm not saying hats is a good thing, but some people really like hats. At the same time, we notice that the only thing this developer is talking about is like business stuff. Like, how should we sell the game? Like, why are you spending so much time thinking about this? Don't you trust us? If you don't trust us, then we should have a separate discussion. But if you trust us, take it easy. We'll take your suggestions, but we can't make a game into a free-to-play, into a non-free-to-play game, and then back again and forth, depending on what's happening in the Kickstarter sphere, essentially. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Could you see in the future development towards educational game where the market is the sector of governance, like schools, healthcare sector, politics?
Okay. The question is if we see a section of the game publishing industry becoming very much focused on education and stuff like that. Yes, of course. Niches occur whenever a market becomes broad enough. Serious games and edutainment, or just pure education, is something that's getting more and more recognized. If I was a Minister of Education, the first thing I'd introduce in every school course is achievements. Like, a lot of people talk about gamification and stuff, but once you introduce meta goals in education, people start getting motivated in different ways. And in school, it's not about what your motivation is for learning the stuff. It's all about learning it. It doesn't matter how it gets into your head. So I think that there's definitely a niche for that, but not yet, because it's not. It's still considered a waste of time, essentially, in a lot of ways, sitting by the computer, because you can goof around so much. But absolutely, Paradox has made a business by selling niche games, extremely niche games. Like, we did Ship Simulator Extremes. Like, you can't get more niche than that, essentially. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. No, you're gonna get the asshole. Yeah. It's like TripAdvisor, essentially. You get a couple of reviews where they say they have cockroaches everywhere, and then you get the average is 4.5, where everybody else says it's really good. Of course, the guys that we don't work with anymore are probably gonna give us a pretty bad review if the relationship ended badly. And you can take that into consideration. It's the same with other publishers. And then you should talk to those that we're actually working with and and ask them what the problems are. Or just take a look at how many times have they kept working with the same publisher over and over again, for instance. And I think what you'll end up with is no publisher has a perfect track record. And essentially, companies change and stuff. And Paradox is a radically different company today than it was 3 years ago. 3 years ago, we had a half-time producer, one half-time producer in the company. Today, we're 13 producers. Difference, right? So you'll get a broad spectrum, and I think you'll be surprised. I'm not saying that we'll get glowing reviews. Definitely not. But I think that you'll get an honest opinion, and then you'll know. Paradox weaknesses is that they drop titles too early, or they didn't focus enough on this or that. But yeah, essentially, and it's the same with us publishers. We always check what's their track record. Then again, it's really hard when they're students. Any more questions? Specific about contracts or publishers or consoles or Kickstarter or... Yeah. What, I'm not familiar with this. What do you mean? They're ahead of schedule? In Paradox history, one developer has ever delivered a GM before the set date. One developer ever. And we're talking about maybe 150 GMs. Yeah. Yeah. No, what happens if the GM is... if the milestones are early, that's good, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't. It happened once, and they were supposed to deliver on a Thursday. They delivered the Friday before, and that was colossal order in Finland. And I can tell you, they were 4 developers. They wanted to make a transport tycoon game essentially. Citizen Motion is a mass public transportation game. The first feature in the game is experience 100 years of public transportation. Rock Paper Shotgun wrote, I don't know if that's a feature or a punishment. These guys, when they wanted to make the game, said, you know what, we don't want to handle the business stuff, we don't want to handle the contract stuff. Didn't you have a friend that went to business school and was pretty nice at that party? And they went to Marina Hallikainen, and they asked her to be the CEO. And she said, I know nothing about games, I don't play games. And they said, we don't care because we don't want to do that. It doesn't matter. So what she did was that, and she was a really smart and good person, she just knocked on the door of every Finnish CEO and said, I'm coming to your office on Tuesday and you're telling me all you know about game development. And she went to Remedy, Rovio, everybody. And she's the CEO, and they're the only studio that's delivered a GM on before time. So Zeal, the challenge is, it's up to you now. Yeah, the Thursday before, yeah, a week before, and you'll get handsomely rewarded. So, but it doesn't happen. And what happens is that there's slips, and slips happen all the time. It's not okay, but we try to work around those, and we pad times and you pad times, and we don't bring out the banhammer the first instance of slips, essentially. What we try to do is that, and we essentially changed our contract, because before we had 2 options when a milestone was late. We could either reduce the milestone payment, or we could cancel the project. That essentially meant that the project was dead in whatever case. So if we wanted to take any kind of legal action or enforce the contract, we had to cancel the project. And that did not leave any kind of room that was good for us, the project, or the developers. So what we said instead was that we need to find some kind of leeway, something that incentivizes making sure that we hit those deliveries. And we have systems in our contracts where, for instance, if you deliver on time, you get a royalty increase or a bonus increase. Or if you're late, you get a small increase instead of a decrease instead of canceling the entire thing. The more leeway you have in a contract, the better. Yes? Oh yeah, absolutely. This is again paradox. Like we have a really close relationship with our fans on the forums. Everybody posts from the CEO to the QA people, and we get butchered if we if we're assholes. Essentially, that's a unique selling point that Paradox has, is that we're liked by the community because we're not assholes. And if you just go to Pirate Bay and look at the comments you see on the Magicka torrents and compare those to the Black Ops torrents, for instance. It's not the degree of regret and shame that you find in the Paradox torrent comments compared to those where Bobby Kotick is the CEO. Different. So the moment we lose that kind of cred, that's when Paradox loses one of our most valuable, unique selling points. And I mean, that's invaluable, and that factors into it. So whenever we stop supporting a game, whenever we release too much DLC or DLC that people don't like, or if we have Steam on one game and we don't have a non-Steam version, or if one of the borders in Yugoslavia is wrong, people boycott our games, essentially. These are the realities that we deal with. So morality, yeah, it comes into it, but I mean, do you have a more specific situation that you in mind? I mean, yes, the classic discussion of day one DLC, what should be in the game and what shouldn't be in the game. And we try not to upset gamers, essentially. Okay, but at the same time, we know that DLC sells incredibly well, and we have to balance that out. Like the entire Mass Effect EA thing, that they got the worst Company of the Year award because they released a DLC day one, just because gamers thought that was cheap, because they felt they were entitled to something without having any kind of insight into the production details, planning, or what BioWare or EA had in mind. I think it's pretty arrogant, and I don't know. Also, perceptions are changing. I mean, Blizzard announced always online connectivity for Diablo 3, and that kind of goes. I'm so happy they did that, because that means that when I do it, people aren't as mad. Essentially, yes. Yes. When we cancel a project, which we've done extremely seldomly, is that we do it when the developer, when they haven't delivered, or they go kaput, or that the quality is so low that it essentially becomes we can't sell that even if it's completed. Or it could be even that the project is delayed so many times that we don't think that it will ever see the light of the day. And what happens essentially, it's on a case-by-case basis. What the good situation is, essentially we say we have to terminate this project. They send us what they have, and it's over. And the other side would be that you say, you know what, we want the money back. We haven't done that. We haven't been in that situation. Essentially. Yeah, but that's how you do it. You say, our contracts at least say that you pay for a milestone in advance. So you've already actually been paid for the milestone you deliver. So you just say that, okay, we looked at this milestone, it's not approved, we will terminate this project at this time. This varies very much from developer to publisher to publisher. And yeah, Linda. She wants to know about releasing games on Xbox Live. How much time do I have? 5. Let's say 5. I'm so over time right now. Okay, I'll let this be my final spiel. Again, what I said was that the best part of software development is iterating, doing more stuff, giving gamers what they want. If everybody wants a St. Patrick's Day hat, or everything in the game should be green during that one day, I'd love to give them that. But Microsoft and Sony have procedures in place to protect their platform, and as a result, there's rigidity in the system, and you can't do those kind of things. I'll tell you a story about Magica. Magica has to date sold 1.4 million copies, which is crazy. No Paradox game has ever even come close, and it's way huger than anything we've ever done, and it's because of the brilliance of Arrowhead and smart marketing by us. So we tried pitching the game to Microsoft, and for those of you that don't know, Magica is a game where you are co-op. It's a co-op action game where you play 4 wizards who combine elements that kill stuff in the forest of Fantasyland. What happened was that we pitched the game to Microsoft and they said no, because it's too generic. And that's one of the selling points of Magica, that it's very generic. And the second was that they said that there are too many role-playing games on Xbox Live. And it's not even a role-playing game. So we said screw it. And we then, around release, pitched again, and they said no, for the same reasons, essentially. And we pitched to Microsoft first party. And essentially, if we want to release a game on XBLA, and I should tell you this, it works in 2 ways. Either you go first party or you go third party. Okay? First party, it's a normal publisher. They have to approve it, and then you sign a contract, and then you do it, and then it kind of gets released. Okay? The other way is third-party publishing. To get a third-party slot, you have to release a game in retail, an Xbox game in retail. And I'll tell you briefly how bad that is. If you want to do a game in retail, you have to first finance the entire game yourself. Okay? You have to have that game. Then, for each copy you want to print, each Xbox retail copy you want to print, you have to pay a licensing fee to Microsoft. That's 10 euros. Okay? You have to pay this upfront. So you have to pay for the manufacturing, pay for the production of the game, you have to pay for the licensing fee, and then you print, say, 50,000 units in each territory. Then you ship these out to retail. Then retail starts selling, and you make maybe $25 on each copy that's sold. So after 60 days, retail comes back to you and says, we sold half of the things you sold us, and here's the check. So you have to essentially ligga ute, pay for those 90 days with all your own funds, and hopefully you make the money back. And it's less than half of the value of each copy. Digital sales, much higher. So essentially, the only ones that can afford to do retail are the big publishers that have a lot of money. Okay? So that essentially means that we're definitely out. And we're not even doing retail, so why would you even consider doing that? So we can't do third party. And that's the truth for almost everybody. So that leaves first party. You pitch to Microsoft, they say asinine things like it's too generic and stuff, and they don't get your game, right? So what happened? E3, we met with Microsoft again, and we said that, okay, Magica has now sold 600. Oh, they also said that. They said that it's too generic, we have too many RPGs, and we don't think it can sell 250,000 copies. So in June, we meet again, and we tell them we've sold 600,000 copies on PC alone. And they went silent for a moment, and they said, we should really talk. Then we started talking more, and then it took from June to December, and we started submitting stuff. Who's ever seen the concept submission form from Microsoft? Is it a pleasant read? No. It's a 16-page monster, and you have to describe your game in a ways you've never described it before. And it's like an anal cavity search, basically, for your game. So we start talking to Microsoft again. In December, we submit everything, and we're just waiting for them to answer. And they're still saying that we don't think that the game can sell 250,000 copies in December. I contact them again in January and say, guys, what's going on? Do you want to do this or not? During these 45 days while we've been waiting for them to answer, we've actually sold 250,000 more copies on Steam. So it's a difficult process. Even though you've sold, I mean, I'm probably pretty naive. There are a lot of reasons that I'm not aware of, and Paradox probably fucked up in 10 different ways that I don't know, and that's why they're saying no. But a game that sold this many copies has a difficult time getting on Xbox. And then you reach a point where you get the contract, and like you said before, the contract and the split you get from Microsoft is significantly different from what kind of split you get from different other outlets. Like the standard in the industry is 70-30 in your favor. Steam or digital outlets or different places, 30 is generally how it works. It's different with the console holders. And you release your game and you want to patch it. Well, you can only do this or that many patches the first 30 days, 90 days, or the first month. On the Sony platform, you had to pay for the traffic. If you had a patch, and you had to pay like €0.50 for each gigabyte that people downloaded to patch your game. So Magica, for instance, was released in a broken state. We patched it 14 times in 13 days or something. We patched it so much that the torrent groups stopped posting new torrents of the game. They couldn't keep up with us. They actually just posted and said, we won't be posting tomorrow's build because they have a big update coming on Friday or whatever. So that was my personal moment where we outpaced the torrent groups. And we would never have been able to do this on the consoles. And then your response is, well, don't release a buggy game, asshole. Of course. But what if I want to give you 14 free DLCs 14 days in a row? I can't do that. So, it's not easy getting stuff out. And once it's out, it doesn't mean it's easy to work with. What you can do, a third route is something that we pursued, is that you can go to one of those publishers that have third-party slots, like the German retail publishers, and you can buy XBLA slot from them. Then they have to pitch the game, and they'll take 10%, 15%, 20%. But the game will come out eventually. But it's through them as a publisher. Yes? Yes, but that's how it works. I know. I know that you know. So it's unofficial. I don't know. Maybe they'll plug it. But the thing is for consoles that every E3, I expect them to announce some kind of App Store initiative, opening up their platform. They must be seeing what's happening on the App Store, on Steam. They have to be seeing this. But every year, what I see, okay, the big news 2 years ago was that they finally integrated Twitter and Facebook into the Xbox. Last year, it was Kinect the year after. You are the controller, right? So we've gotten tired of trying to wait for them to catch up with us, essentially. So PC, that's where it is. It's the new black, or the old black, or whatever. So I think we're definitely over time. No more questions. You can come up to me and talk with me afterwards, or just contact me. I'll be happy to answer. Thank you so much for your time.